another Monday night studying this absolutely amazing book, Planetary Transition, by our great friend Manoel Philomeno de Miranda and medium Divaldo Franco. So this is another great night that we're going to be talking about two very interesting chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9 in our story. And of course, I would like to thank everyone that's joined us tonight. Some of our usual faces that I'm seeing coming in. Thank you all for coming again. And some new friends that are joining us here. So for those who are joining us for the first time, this is a study of Manoel Philomeno de Miranda's works, and we're starting with the book Planetary Transition. So every Monday night, we're going to have a chance to go through some of this incredible teachings, right, that Manoel Philomeno brings to us, particularly focusing the interaction of the spiritual world and obsessions, and some of the challenges, right, that they see from the spiritual side, and how can we work together, right, to get this improved, right? Hello, good night again. Thank you for joining us. Good night, everyone. So as we normally do every Monday night, we're going to start with our prayer, right? And for everyone that's joined us, let us all kind of focus our minds and our hearts in our Master Jesus, our Father, Mother, God, our Creator. And let us ask the blessings for this moment of teaching and learning that we're going to have. And may we receive the teachings and the blessings that we need so much. And may all our spiritual friends and mentors that are in need can connect with us at this moment, allowing us to have this love in action, charity, and learning together. Thank you, God. Hello, Eve. How are you doing? Nice to see you again one more time. All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about two chapters again, and we're going to get started right into it. We're going to be going over chapter 8 that talks about this unexpected assistance, which will be very interesting, right? On the planetary transition. And right after that, we're going to talk about existential challenges. And then we're going to go through a very heart-wrenching, challenging case that Manoel Philomeno is going to encounter. And of course, the whole idea is that we're going to learn a lot from it. Okay? All right. So for those of us who are connected for the first time, this is, again, a study of Manoel Philomeno, which, he worked for many years in Brazil, and the Spiritist Center, was a very prominent figure in the mediumistic meetings and many disobsession sessions, and was actively engaged in teaching many Spiritist Center about the communication of the spiritual world and influence of the spiritual world in our world. And then when discarnated, presented himself to João de Angelis and then to Valdir Franco, and started this collaborative work about focusing on the influence of the spiritual world in our world and mediumship, right? So that's the main focus of our story, and we're in the first book still, right? And lots to learn. All right, let's get started. Okay. So chapter 8, let's see what we're going to learn here. Like, the first thing is that the chapter 8 starts with this incident, right? As Manoel Philomeno describes, right? And the incident is basically some sort of a brawl or a fight, right? That can happen. It happens in the spiritual world. And this is quite interesting, because obviously Manoel Philomeno was not fully aware, right, of all the complexities, right, of the spiritual world. And if we go to chapter 8, and I'm going to read a little bit about what we're talking, so that comes back to chapter 7, which describes that incident where many of the spirits from that group decided to somewhat attack, right, our missionaries there. And then it just as a reminder of what happened at the end of it, all of them, right, guided and blinded by this beautiful love, right, from the mentor, Dr. White, they dropped their weapons, they allowed themselves to be helped, and they joined the group of missionaries. Some of them are rescued, some of them are going to be starting to help them. And in the very end of chapter 7, Dr. White, the guide, spiritual guide, he's going to say, Jesus always wins, right? Because basically, and just I'm going to go back to the very first chapter, last chapter of the previous, last paragraph of the previous chapter, so you guys remember that, right? So the leader of that group, right, was trying to put a fight, right? And then Dr. White said, "Come on, also you who are thirsty for light and love." That's what he says. His face filled with horror, the unfortunate commander let a strange noise, and with a weird grimace, after shaking like a leaf, he was taken by something like a seizure. He screamed and literally fell to the ground. Some of his subordinates who were holding the dogs and instruments of war were dismayed at what happened and disbanded in a noisy run. Soon after, there was silence interrupted only by the tide of convulsive sobbing of the candidates for renewal, right? And then that's the end of that fight, right? Incident that happened. But now we're moving to the next chapter. All those afflicted spirits now they opted, right, during that moment to surrender to love, right? Because love always wins. That's what Dr. White says. And obviously this is not happening by chance. This is very organized, right? So Dr. White will bring a group of spirits to help them out, specifically to rescue them, right? And specific arrangements are made. Some of those spirits now, imagine, like they've been blinded by this idea that there were like some sort of a powerful group, right? That had control over everything, like empowered by that darkness, right? By that constant thought of evil, right? They were numb to what they were really were, right? And now that they opened up and they're kind of allowed themselves to feel again, right? They now realize the deplorable state that they are. Now, this is quite shocking. Like, think about this, right? These spirits are thinking like they have superpowers, right? And they're uh, like this group of spirits taking control of everything. Now they finally release themselves of that energy, but now they can see themselves for real, for who they are. And that's a shock, right? And Dr. White describes as they now look at their own pain, they're able to look at their infirmities, right? The marks on the perispiritual body from all the sores and deformities, everything they've been through. Now they're fully aware of who they are, right? And it's painful, right? It's almost like this first step of inner transformation is like looking inside yourself. So, my friends, exactly like happened with us when we're incarnated, the same thing's going to happen when we're discarnated. It's not going to change, right? How many of us heard this concept, right? That we're going to that we need to transform ourselves, we need to know ourselves and all those things, right? So when we're incarnated, right, knowing yourself requires a monumental amount of work, right? Because we create layers to ourself or our ego, right, that allow us to interact with the external world, like in the super ego, right, that allow us to live in some sort of a normalcy, independent of all these energies and histories and stories and thoughts and experiences that we have that we try to hide as much as possible, right? So when we're doing therapy and we're going through those things, that's we start to kind of take from inside and kind of show a little bit of a time of all those thoughts and talk about it. For all of us who've been through some of this, you can probably relate to the fact that it's very painful to look inside yourself sometimes and realize truly who you are. Sometimes it's hard because you're going to find some ghosts, like we like to call, right, inside. Now imagine in the spiritual world now, where you're doing that, but you don't have those layers to disguise, right? So basically, your spiritual body and your thoughts reveal fully, 100%, all the time, who you really are. And these spirits are now encountering that. In other words, they're opening their real eyes to understand, like, wow, this is basically who I am, right? It is very difficult. So much so that some of the spirits will go into the state of shock and they go to sleep, right? They shut down, right? Very similar to a state of shock that we see in patients sometimes who are incarnated, right? There's not a lot of differences. The only difference here is that one is happening when you're in a body, the other one is happening when you don't have a physical body. But who you are and how you behave, it's always the same, right? So it's a very powerful message to us, right, my friends? And again, if you have any comments, questions, anything, you can type in. I can actually see your comments on this side, okay? Now, then Manoel Philomeno goes into this learning mode, they call, right? Let's talk about this, right? And then he's going to say, well, he's going to ask, right? Having in mind the fact that the brothers who assaulted us spoke the national language and could not understand one another, how are you able to communicate with them? He's asking Dr. White, right? That's a great question, right? Because remember, the group of missionaries that we're following includes all different types of spirits, right? Because we're rescuing Muslims, Jews, Catholics, atheists, all of them. They're all being rescued, right? And certain spirits are coming there with specific missions, right? So now, of course, you can imagine, right? So if you want to, and some of them are from England, others are from incarnated last time in Brazil. So some of them are still very much connected to their language they spoke when they're incarnated. Now they're coming in, and of course, Manoel Philomeno is going to ask the question. And this is what Dr. White explains, which is a really nice way of explaining it, is that, so he basically talks through mental waves, right? No verbalization. So all the communication is happening at a mental projection level, like through those thoughts, right? And the afflicted brothers, they were able to hear that through their own language because it accesses the language processing centers directly. So they translate that mental energy into their own languages. So for them, it's like they're hearing their native language, right? And every single one of those spirits are going to hear that message in their own languages. Isn't that beautiful, right? So very, very much a powerful tool, right, that we have in this moment to communicate, right? So, and then they continue that the language of the universe is your thought. How beautiful is that, right? In the incarnate world, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because I know we can feel the thoughts sometimes. Oh, yeah, I can tell you that. Imagine you're going to a room where there's a lot of this disturbing negative energy towards you through their thoughts, the thought projections, right? You can feel it. You go into a room, you're like, I don't feel very welcomed here. You can tell right away when you got into the door, right? So that's you feeling those thoughts, right? Physically, right? But in your processing center, you're almost able to translate those a little bit. Your physical body prevents you from doing that fully, but you can do a little bit of processing to feel that, right? So the spiritual world is basically like fully on that, right? Because you don't have the body to shield that from you. So actually, the perispirit decodes that information, right? Those waves of thought that are projected as a communication, right? And then they will use their language centers from previous experiences to translate that back into their language. So it's amazing. But basically, it explains, for example, why higher spirits can present anywhere in the world, at any place, at any time, and they always communicate perfectly with whoever human incarnated are there. That's something that, sometimes is puzzling for a lot of us coming from other backgrounds and religions and, coming from a science background sometimes, right? Because physically, on the physical body, we cannot explain that, right? But from the perispiritual perspective, then it's very easy to do, right? Because we can always access the information that we have from the past. It's not hard to understand. For example, when you see how many videos you've seen of 4-year-olds that can get into a piano and play this beautiful like concert for piano, like in it's like nothing's happening, right? obviously they're not using new knowledge, right, to achieve that. They accessing their former musical and motion control centers in their perispiritual body through their thoughts, and they're able to rescue those easily through their developing body still, which is amazing, right? So that shows how much ability they have to re-access that information, right? Some people can learn languages very easily. Others have a very hard time doing that. Well, that's easily explained. If you've incarnated in countries that have that particular language, it's a lot easier for you to re-access those instead of places that you haven't really been before, right? So all of that makes a huge difference, right? So that is basically a nice explanation of the communication in the spiritual world, right? And continue on, the group now brings this vehicle, right, to rescue those workers, right, that are coming out. They're coming out to rescue those repentant brothers, the ones that were attacking them, and actually now are being rescued. How beautiful is that, right? Because it shows so well what Jesus did when he was attacked, right? And of course, many of us will look at the Bible and have all this historical perspectives on it, right? So, yes, they're expecting Jesus to kind of raise their sword and be the king of this planet, which clearly not the case. We knew that. Others were trying to incite people for a revolution. Others were shying away. Everybody was puzzled, like why someone not attacking back is asking for forgiveness for all the attackers. This is kind of what we're looking at here in the spiritual world too. So Dr. White is actually already knowing that he's going to get there and he's going to actually rescue those brothers. So not even for a second he's worried about them, right? He's not like, oh yeah, we have all this spirits that are going to attack and going to make a hard time for us to. No, he's such an evolved state of mind that he's seeing everyone there as in need of help, particularly the ones, right, that are going through the processes that we learned about in chapter 4, 5, 6, right, which is like all sorts of abnormalities of the perispirit. They presented themselves in scary ways and aggressive ways and showing like this very scary tools and aggressiveness, right? That is a direct reflection of their own suffering. Dr. White can see that. Like other spirits that are incarnated can see that. Like Jesus was able to see that, right? Throughout his entire existence, because he's such an evolved spirit, right? So it's also a lesson to us, right? To start to understand that whenever we meet those individuals that are ready for a fight, ready for an argument, ready to make things hard, we cannot go into that same vibration. We can't, right? We cannot. We have, and this is the same saying my grandma used to tell me, and everyone's grandma used to tell you, take the high road. In other words, like just go, like, in other words, put your vibrations up to the sky, you know, and don't engage with this. Like you don't want to be at the same level of that same sentiment, same energy, right? And this is such a true teaching in anywhere in the universe. Cannot go wrong, right? And this is yet another example of Manoel Philomeno now in the spiritual world teaching us that. Right, my friends? We'll continue. This is interesting, right? And Yvonne Costa, which is also a member of this expedition, right, says less than 2 hours before, those brothers had belonged to a lower order spirit world. Now they're heading towards happiness. So see, again, going back, see this chapter, if you miss this, important to read again. It talks about knowing yourself. It talks about understanding kind of who we are in the perspective of evolution, but also understanding that we can change at any single second, right? This is the worker of the last hour. These are the people. This is the prodigal son. This is all together the examples that we have in the Bible over and over and over and over. Now, with a real example from the spiritual world saying exactly the same thing, my friends, right? Here we are. Yes, it's hard. Yes, we can wake up our eyes at any time and see who we really are. Sometimes it's hard, but that's the first step to take that out, right? Process it and work on it. And whenever you do that, that's exactly what happens to the spirits. And Yvonne Costa is saying, we come from here and we start on the road to the right place. That's where we should be, because we recognize spiritists by the efforts we make, right? Not by being perfect. We're not perfect, right? We'll be one day. That's the only thing we know for a fact, right? We'll get there. All right, my friends. There's more. This chapter is still coming, right? And there's more interesting stories in the next chapter. Okay. Now, this is now more fun facts. I like this part too, because now, see, they've been working for a long time and they've been helping a lot of spirits, and we kind of get that part of the story. But then Dr. White comes and say, you know what? Let's go back and return to our headquarters, which is basically this large open field hospital, many wards, right? There's lodgings reserved for the individuals who are in the rescue mission, like including Manoel Philomeno, and they finally go, right, to rest a little bit. They've been working for a long time, as you remember in the story, right? Um, and um, and this is an interesting point, because even at that level in the spiritual world, the organization, and we're talking about organization since the first chapter, like everything is incredibly well planned, directed, and effectively put in practice. So this is again a great example for us to stop thinking of the spiritual world as this magical, I don't know what place that seems like everything is some sort of magical, to actually like a real world, right? It's just devoid of your physical body, though, that you connect and communicate and vibrate in a different level, but very similar, still, like at that level of evolution, still very similar to what we encounter here. It's just an optimized version still of what we encounter, right? Of course, you want to go on the rescue mission. For those who have seen all this incredible work, for example, of Fraternity Without Borders, for example, right? When they go into a country, it's not that, they go there and kind of, you know, see what happens kind of thing. No, they have a plan. They have an organization, they have funding, they have people to work, they have a group of people doing specific jobs, they have a time to rest, they have a time to work, they have goals, objectives, like, that everything is in place, right? So that's not different, right, from the spiritual world. Okay. And now Manuel's resting, so he's talking about trying to remember and understand life on earth, and now making a parallel to life in the spiritual world, right? And he's saying something interesting, because he's saying, he really tried. He's a spiritist working on the obsession, spirit center, very much into spiritism. And now in the spiritual world, he's thinking and saying, well, I really tried to understand what life in the spiritual world was like when I was in the body, but it's kind of hard to do, right? And he went into a prayer, right, to the brothers and sisters that they just rescued. And then they start to dream. Why not, right? When they rest there, they can also go in through moments that they dream, just like, we do in our physical world. So it's very interesting. If you want to read more, it's the very end of chapter 8. Very interesting reading this part, right? For our knowledge. All right, my friends. So that's chapter 8. Like, they rescued the guys that just attacked them. Isn't that beautiful, right? All right. Oh, that's a great question. Eve, in times of planetary transition, is assistance something we earn, or is it more something that flows from universal compassion? Great question. He's going to address that in the next chapter a little bit. But it is basically, of course, a combination of different things, right? Assistant always occur, always. I think the biggest difference is that, sometimes we can be ready to be assisted, and other times we're not ready to be assisted, right? And that transition between being ready or not ready can happen at any time, right? So in other words, there's always an incredible machinery, like incredible system behind, of flowing directly from creator, from God, to all the higher order spirits, to the lower order spirits, and everything is put in place to support us, to help us, and to make us improve, to grow spiritually, right? So even if we are at the most devastating possible imaginary place, right? Like some of the places we're here in like in planetary transition, there's always going to be help there, right? Even for a second, even if it's like a mental vibration, even, and then at some point that spirit will able to connect to that help and then efficiently be rescued, right? So in a way, assistance is always there. Now, do we earn some sort of bonus point? Of course, like the after we were rescued and then we engage into that same system, then of course we start to grow and we start to get opportunities, right? To grow even more, like the talent. Remember, like you get one talent, can't hide it under the ground. You actually have to make it grow, right? So that's the same idea. So the rescue stage is the first, and then after the rescue, you start to get access, right, to that ability to grow even more and then help others and then be part of that same system that just rescued you. That's the beauty, right? Um, so yes, we always get it, but sometimes we kind of put a little helmet, a little blockage around us, right? That we get into this and that's exactly what happened with this group of individuals, right? So these spirits are absolutely suffering for dozens of years, right? And but in presenting themselves as some sort of very angry looking kind of diabolical figures, right? And if you see through them, they're the ones that need help, right? That's what Dr. White said. But you see, they also helped. Same way. Doesn't matter, right? Because they're also gonna grow. They're also gonna transition. They're also gonna actually they're gonna come back and help them, right? Help others, right? So yes, we're always helped, and that's the good part of it. Right, Eve? Okay. So let's keep going. Chapter 9. Okay. So chapter 9 talks about existential challenges, right? And I'll tell you exactly why we're talking about an existential challenge, right? As Manoel Philomeno writes really well in this chapter. Okay. So, first thing, they're going to wake up, right? In the spiritual world, right? They're resting, right? Of course, sleep in the spiritual world is slightly different from sleep in our world because we don't have a body that needs rest. It's a combination of more of a mental recovery, right? Vibration is more, it's slightly different from the physical matter that we're used to, but it still happens, right? And then you're going to obviously get to a point that you don't need those rests anymore, right? Because if you're really, really higher spirit, you're going to work all the time and you don't feel that tiredness. You don't need to feel that type of rest anymore. But that's a process, right? The closer you are to our level of understanding of the universe, the closer you are to what we do on earth, right? That's why the spirits are going to the hospital, they go to a bed, they fall asleep, right? Some of them have to eat still, as we learned from Andrea Louise, right? Nostolar, you can read Nostolar explains it very, very well, okay? But this is an interesting thing because they say, a contrast of sun and dark heaviness from this desolate area. So they can see the physical sun, they see it in a different way, but they also see the storms covering the area. And these are not storms that water-based storms that we're talking about here, right? This is storms of vibrationary storms. In other words, the negative vibration, the that dense, like a combination of remorse and aggressiveness and anger, like all of those things together generate this incredible amount of energy from those thoughts collectively that look like dark matter, and that takes over the place almost like a storm. And then he compares it perfectly to actually a thunderstorm with lightning and strikes and negativity. That's very interesting because um, that's exactly how some people project the idea of hell, right? It's like this dark clouds and fire, like all this physical, disturbing images, right? And that's kind of how that projection of thoughts happens, right? It's a collective projection of thoughts, right, that creates this atmosphere. And Manoel Philomeno says, it's very similar to what a major storm looks like in the physical world, right here, right? So that's actually very interesting to analyze too. So let's talk about the main character, right, of this um, seller of illusions. Okay, so who's this person? So this chapter is about this spirit, the female spirit that's under obsession, right, discarnated, right, and still connected to the decomposing body. The mother comes now. The mother also discarnated and starts to tell the story, right? So the mother is now as a intervening, right, to help her daughter, and those are bonus points we get, right, because she's helping her daughter. Obviously, the power of her prayer very intense. It connects to the energy of the mentors of the mission, so everything is kind of connecting together to help the spirit, right, as we just discussed, right, Eve? So, and then she tells a story, right? So this spirit, she's been married for 14 years. She was married at 14 years old with an older male. 2 months after the wedding, she's taken to this brothel and then start to work in prostitution, right? Very sad story, right? And with time and the natural decline of her body and that conditions that she was living at, she was obviously being abused in so many different ways, right? She's now connected to using certain drugs, right? That it made it even harder for her, right? Her mother tried to help her, and that's kind of devastating to hear from a spiritual world, right? Because this mother has been helping, trying to help her daughter during incarnated life, and now in this discarnated life, right? Um, but she was not able to help. Finally, her main abuser, which is her husband, right, basically kicks her mother out of the story and basically says, "No, you can't get close to her anymore." So lost that thread of hope, right, that she still had, right? The daughter then becomes very violent, very aggressive. Again, combination of all the abuse, psychological, physical, all everything you can imagine. Plus now using drugs in the environment she is. It's a bad combination, and she starts to completely lose control. Right? No one knew what was happening. Right at the time, she was incarnated. The mother eventually describes that she dies of heart attack due to all these things that are happening to her daughter. So it's a really catastrophic um, event, right? And she begs basically the group to help her, right? And this is on in the beginning of chapter 9, right? That's in the beginning of the chapter 9, okay? So here's now, I'm going to read directly from the book. That's a very interesting uh, passage here, okay? So she continues to say, right? So a demonic being took possession of her and has disgraced her ever since those not so long days of aberration. So what happened is, while she was in that scenario, going through all those challenges we heard about, she opened herself to a lot of spiritual influences, right? And then the spirits continue, right? There was no doubt that the young dancer had attracted a terrible lover from the past, previous experiences, right? One that had been physically connected to her while she was in the physical body. Jealous of her loose conduct, he began exploiting her in sexual perversions, usurping her emotional energies and frequently causing her to have terrible obsessive fits. So, what was happening then with her? It's very different from what everybody thought. What was happening to her, she was actually being a victim of a very, very severe type of obsession, right? And if you go to the medium's book, now I'm gonna open here. Um, I'm gonna go here, take this out. I'm gonna put this. This is from the medium's book, right? The Kindle version, right? And we talk about the types of obsession. So we go to something we call subjugation, right? Simple obsession is a constant influence, right, of some malevolent spirits directly to individuals, right? And then if we keep going here, you're going to say this fascination, which is a more serious one. It's more of a delusion created by the spirit that takes control and paralyze the ability of mediums and people to understand that they're being obsessed. And then we go to the process of subjugation that we have there. So, what is subjugation? So, this is from Kardec, right? So, subjugation is a constriction that causes its victim's will to become paralyzed. So, she does not have more control of her will anymore, right? In other words, they find themselves under this true bond. It's like it's a complete connection that all her body responds and reacts to the mind of the obsessor spirit, right? It could be mental or physical, as Kardec says. In the former, those who are subjugated are allowed to make frequently absurd and compromising decisions, which, under a kind of delusion, they regard as sane. My friends, now think carefully. Do you think that this type of influence, just by the description, happens a little bit or a lot? Right? This is interesting because we're talking about spiritual influences as something that happens to someone else, right? But the reality is what Manoel Philomeno is bringing with the story is that, listen, that can happen to any one of us and to other people, famous people, politicians, your bosses, CEOs, right? People that work with you, people that you see sometimes, people that are in the news. That can happen to everyone, every time, all the time, right? Remember, subjugated through the mental subjugation means they're frequently doing absurd and compromising decisions that we can look on the outside and say, that does not make sense. Why is these people doing that? Why are they saying that? That does not. Here we are, right? Which, under a kind of a delusion, they regard as saints. So in their minds, they're doing perfect. This is the best possible thing they can say or do or write or post nowadays, right? It is a type of fascination. In the letter, the spirit acts upon the physical organ. So you can that a physical one, basically the spirit takes control of the body to a point that the person talks in a different way or, does things that are absurd. But in the mental part, they will actually just have thoughts and actions that are absurd, right? So that's important, right? So we can go back now. So again, this is the Medium's book, okay? And if you want to read more about it, and I recommend you doing that to understand this, this is chapter 23, right? Chapter 23, Obsession, Medium's book. Going back to our story now, right? Here's a description. Let's go to the book so you can have a perfect description, okay? So this is Manoel Philomeno's description now. So I examined the obsessor's psyche and perceived mental scenes involving the most shocking aberrations. Because remember, the thought is fully visible, right? Along with his revolt due to her death caused by the tsunami, which threatened his exploitation of her energies, so deep were the links between them, perispirit to perispirit, that this stuck her like a mollusk in its shell, like someone who's stuck inside a shell, right? Perversely threatening her. I approached the poor woman and applied soothing, calming energies, putting her to sleep, right? A slight torpor. Meanwhile, her mother prayed sutras from the Koran, right? That's their faith, right? Filled with emotion while watching me apply the therapy. Once I was able to make the spirit sleep, so that's the strategy they're taking, right? They put in the spirit to sleep so they can start to make that disconnect, right? I began disconnecting from its organic viscera to help with the kindness of Abdul, which is a friend, right? The two closely linked entities reminded me of conjoined spiritual twins. They are so connected, right? The obsessor and the victim. The evildoer shouted deliriously, afraid of losing the prey he had exploited for years, while Abdul spoke with him kindly but forcefully about the crime he was perpetrating, informing him that his exploitation ended with her death, which had effectively separated them. Now he would have to face the adverse consequences of his cruelty. There you go. So they're helping separate this obsession that is actually happening in the physical world and continuing in the spiritual world, right? And that's part of the rescue, right? That's the part where we are, right? Um, Now we talked about this deep connection. The obsession started during their lives and continue in the spiritual world. They also talk about the perfect connection, right, or the plug, right? So the centers of energy, so the both the cerebral, cranial, right, coronal, right, and then the different other centers of energy you have, they provide this connection points, right, where some of these obsessions can occur, right? And depending on how intimately connected you are through your thoughts, that connection through your centers of energy or chakras, right, it can be very, very intense, right? And this is one of the reasons that that was happening, right? But Manuel also says something very interesting, right? That no one is in a position to redeem moral and spiritual debts by making themselves victims. In other words, by making someone yourself a victim, you're actually not recovering or rescuing your deeds. You have to proactively engage into beneficial things and moving forward, not victimizing, right? That's a big difference, right? That we see in this story, right? And there are some reflections for us. So, in the organic illusion, us, we prefer unhealthy, irresponsible enjoyment with absurd ideas, right, of miraculous solutions, right? So we do all these wrong things. That's what he's saying. And all of a sudden, we want some sort of a miracle, right, to somehow get rid of it, right? And then he continues, Manoel Philomeno. It is not surprising that a large number of us will turn to spiritism and mediumship. Here we are, right? That's exactly where we are, looking for a miracle cure, right? For the problems they created and they want resolved. Okay. My dear friends, there's miracles, right? Let's think about that, right? It's an important point, right? Because, yes, you see, we are responsible for everything that we do and we've done, right? And Manuel obviously is very clear about it. We need to start that transformation, just like the guys that were attacking them. Now, like Yvonne Costa said, now they're moving on. They're in the pathway to happiness, right? But that requires a process. That requires that transformation. That requires understanding who we are and where we're connecting and where we're going to, right? And the fact that there's this idea of a miracle cure, it doesn't really exist. What exists is like effort, right, towards transformation. The miracle is basically knowing that we're all going to be perfect one day. This is incredible, right? This is what Jesus tells us, and that's it. There's no running away from it. That's the consolation, right? But the truth is, it's really a daily grind, right? A daily effort in a constant goodness, as André Luis says in the book Evolution to Worlds. Constant goodness generates constant goodness. In other words, this is generates like a cycle of positivity and protection. Is the immunity that we need for our bodies, right? That's what it is. Okay, my friends. And the reflections to finalize now at the end of it, he'll continue with the end of the chapter 9. That our physical body is really this learning opportunity that life grants, right? For growth, resources, right? To build and grow that divine spark inside of us, right? Each reincarnation is a sublime and divine concession. All that we know, right? And I was talking to my son today. We had this very interesting conversation in the car today. And we're talking, he asked me this incredible question. He said, what is the most exceptional, fantastic thing from God that you think, Daddy? Like, what is the most amazing thing you can possibly imagine? And I thought about it because this, like, oh my God, this is an interesting question, right? And then I said, Danny, I think it's the chance that we have to wake up every day, every single day, and actually have a chance again and again, right? And again, and a chance to be the best day, to be a better day than the day before, and to work on do something that we can be proud of, and have another chance. And then when those chances in the incarnated world end, we still have we go through discarnate lives, and then we come back, and then we do it again. It's incredible, right, that we're actually having this chance. And Earth is a beautiful school, as Manoel Philomeno says, right? They continue. From our perspective, they could see the greater amount of either despair or balance in the discarnate spirits, right? Enabling them to assist in greater or lesser effectiveness. So that goes exactly to the point, Eve, that we're talking about, is that they can look at all the spirits in that very devastating site, and they can see which ones have more of that balance or more of the despair, and which state they are, and how much they were able to absorb that energy or effectively be rescued, right, in different ways. Some of them are just going to put to sleep and moved away. Others are going to be fully out of it and helping and fully awake and understanding everything. So there's massive differences, right? Others will be completely not ready for it. They'll run away, right? And then they continue, and Manoel Philomeno continues that physical life disguises the appearance of the spirit, right? Which skillfully puts on a mask to show what it would like to be. And that's pretty much us, right? That's us. We do disguise a little bit of our appearances, right? Because the perispirit carries the battle marks, right? And those we see completely in the spiritual world, but we can hide them, right, in the physical world. And then it continues, right? So the landscapes, now he's looking at the scenario, right? We're filled with affliction, as you can imagine, right? This is a tsunami. We're talking about 150 to 200,000 individuals that discarnated almost like instantaneously, right? This is massive, right? This is really a chaotic scene from the physical and the spiritual world, right? But he says, except, and this is my caps, right? Except those who strove to live by the standards, right, of duty regarding their neighbors in life. So in other words, those who you can tell worked on living the life that Jesus proposed to us, they are not in affliction. Remember the stories about the early Christians discarnating. That's the same. Remember Stephen when he's killed by Paul. Remember that, right? By the, under the guidance of Paul, he's stoned to death, right? He wakes up in the spiritual world, ready to go, completely understanding. Is like, God forgive everyone. I'm here to help, and he's gonna help who? The guy that just killed him. Now, talk about evolution. Someone who can actually be stoned to death, wake up in the other side, knowing fully what's going on, and go straight to help the guy that just killed him. That is what we're talking about here, right? This is someone who lived by the standards of duty, respecting their neighbors in life. The more we do it, the less of that type of affliction we're going to be seeing. And there's different levels of it, right? And he says something that I find interesting, because this is a book that talks about all religions in context, right, all the time. And he says that he adds this line, which is important, is that even without religious affiliation, in other words, it doesn't matter who you like to follow, what type of clothes you put on, or whatever type of dogmas you believe in, it does not matter. Because in the end, what matters is caring for one another, respecting one another, loving your neighbor, loving God. Like, so if you do that, it doesn't matter which religion, or even if you don't believe in God, but if you follow what God, the divine laws, it doesn't matter, right? So you're following exactly the laws of God, right? So that essence, which is inside of all of us, whether you like it or not, it's there. That's the spark. And our role is to get that spark, as Manoel Philomeno says, to provide to that spark the ability to reach its fullness, right? And that's, my friends, the big summary of this chapter. Okay. All right. So again, we're coming to the end of chapter number 9. If you guys have any other questions or comments, anything you guys want to bring, this is the time. Okay. If you're watching this after and you want to have comments, I'm happy to take those too, or questions. Like, we can look at it again, and I'll bring some answers the next time around on Monday nights, right? And my friends, again, I really have to thank you, because this is, this is the reason why we're here, right? Is to share this knowledge, share this understanding, right? Some of these challenges, and how can we kind of help each other in this path, right? Because I'm not different than anyone in this story, right? I'm just another spirit that's trying to kind of work on what we're learning here. Okay, my friends. So I don't see any comments or questions, but again, you guys have my heart of thankfulness today, for being here and sharing this with us. And next week, let's talk about next week then. Next week, we're gonna go over chapter number 10, lessons of high magnitude, and we're gonna go chapter number 11, which is called continued learning. Okay. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Isa. So nice to see you guys here. So you guys have a great night, right? God bless you all. Thank you.